Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to take the 13 letters of the Apostle Paul and read them not by their length, but by the thrilling chronological timeline of his actual life. We're going to trace the arc of a man's journey through the very documents that helped shape the course of history.
You know, most Bibles arrange Paul's letters kind of like how you'd sort your emails by size, longest to shortest. Romans is first, Philemon is last. But doing that actually causes you to lose the story. When you read them in the order they were actually written, a completely different picture emerges. It reveals this gripping, very human story of a guy surviving riots, shipwrecks, and literal dungeons, all while desperately trying to hold a brand new movement together.
And get this striking detail. These 13 documents were written over a window of just 15 years. From roughly AD 49 to AD 67, Paul scribbled these thoughts on papyrus, and they were carried by hand across the Mediterranean. They weren't written as textbooks for a fancy library. No, they acted as urgent personal correspondence to people he deeply loved, fiercely debated with, and led.
Section 1. From Enemy to Apostle. Okay, so let's dive into this massive paradox. How did Saul of Tarsus, a strict Pharisee who quite literally hunted early Christians, become the author of the most influential letters in history? Well, the source texts outline a super dramatic timeline. Born in Tarsus, Saul was highly educated in Jewish law and enjoyed Roman citizenship. He was so zealous that he actually stood by approving the stoning of the first Christian martyr, Stephen. But then, on the road to Damascus, he was struck blind by a heavenly light. He reported encountering the very Christ he was trying to destroy. That single event completely upended his worldview and launched his entirely new mission.
Section 2. Putting out church fires. Just imagine trying to guide chaotic, brand new churches while constantly dodging angry mobs and assassins. That is the exact context of his earliest surviving letter, Galatians. It addresses a massive crisis. He had planted churches in Galatia, but soon after he left, other teachers, known as Judaizers, arrived. They insisted that the non-Jewish converts had to follow Jewish ceremonial laws and be circumcised to truly be saved. Because of this, Galatians reads like an absolute street fight. Paul is fiercely defending the concept of grace against teachers who claimed faith just wasn't enough without strict ceremonial performance.
He completely skips the polite small talk here. I mean, usually his letters start with a warm, "I thank God for you," but not this one. He fiercely draws a line in the sand, saying it's either grace or performance, and declares that anyone preaching a different message should literally be accursed.
Now, in stark contrast, his letters to the Thessalonians are deeply affectionate. He had to flee that city in the middle of the night to avoid a mob, leaving a brand new church behind. The Thessalonians were terrified and grieving because they thought their deceased loved ones would somehow miss out on Christ's second coming. So Paul writes to comfort them, assuring this terrified church that the dead are not left behind, but are actually first in line. And then there's Corinth. Man, Corinth was this wealthy, morally chaotic crossroads in the ancient world. And the church Paul planted there fractured almost immediately. When we read 1 Corinthians, it's basically Paul playing theological whack-a-mole. He has to put out fires concerning lawsuits between members, rampant spiritual pride, actually not just pride, but shocking moral compromises that even the surrounding pagan culture found extreme. What's really fascinating here is the context of this famous quote. We hear of 1 Corinthians 13 at almost every romantic wedding, right? But it wasn't written for a wedding card. Paul hit pause in the middle of a heated argument about spiritual gifts to tell a church that was actively ripping itself apart that without love, all their spiritual bragging was just a noisy, clanging cymbal.
By the time he writes 2 Corinthians, the whole mood has shifted. Paul had been publicly humiliated by someone in the church, and false teachers were attacking his credentials. He defends his leadership, but not by listing his successes or his power. He does it with his scars. He notes that he begged God 3 times to remove a tormenting affliction, what he calls a thorn in the flesh, only to receive the answer that God's grace is sufficient and that strength is made perfect in weakness.
Section 3. The masterpiece called Romans. Before Paul finally made it to Rome, a city he was absolutely desperate to visit, he hit pause around AD 57 to write his most brilliant theological argument to a church he had never even visited. Because he couldn't rely on personal relationships with the Romans, the argument had to stand entirely on its own. Romans builds this logical courtroom case step by step. Step 1 is the diagnosis, proving everyone without exception falls short. Step 2 is the cure,
presenting justification freely by grace. And step 3 is the ultimate result, declaring that there is now no condemnation in Christ and that absolutely nothing can separate us from God's love.
Section 4. 4 letters in chains.
So Paul does eventually reach Rome around AD 60, but well, not exactly how he planned. After surviving a violent shipwreck off the coast of Malta, he arrives in Rome as a prisoner, awaiting trial before Caesar. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate paradox of his life. Think about his physical reality for a second. He is under house arrest, physically chained to a rotating guard of Roman soldiers. Yet, his spiritual output in this time yields 4 letters that pull the camera way back to God's cosmic plan, and they're just overflowing with incredible joy and freedom. We call these the prison epistles. While chained, he likely looks right at his Roman guard to describe the armor of God in Ephesians. In Philippians, while facing possible execution, he uses the word joy or rejoice 16 times. In Colossians, he explains that Christ is the fundamental force holding the universe and all its atoms together. And in Philemon, he acts out the gospel in real life, writing a deeply personal plea for a master to forgive and accept a runaway slave named Onesimus as a brother.
Section 5. Final words from the dungeon.
Historical evidence tells us Paul was briefly released, but then arrested again under Emperor Nero around AD 66. But this wasn't house arrest. This time he's thrown into the Mamertine prison, a freezing underground dungeon carved right into stone. From this dark hole, mostly abandoned by his friends, Paul spends his remaining time writing his pastoral epistles to young leaders named Timothy and Titus. He is quite literally passing the baton. These aren't cosmic theological treatises anymore. They are gritty, practical handbooks on how to manage chaotic churches in places like Ephesus and Crete, focusing on character, leadership, and holding on to sound doctrine.
As Paul writes his absolute final letter, 2 Timothy, he's facing imminent execution by beheading. Which brings up a really profound question. What does a man who shaped the course of human history, who traveled the known world planting churches, request in his final days from a cold dungeon?
The answer is surprisingly, incredibly human. He asks for just 2 things. First, a heavy cloak he left at Troas because winter is coming and the stone floor of the dungeon is freezing. Second, he asks for his books and parchments. I mean, that detail is just stunning. It proves that even on the absolute edge of death in a dark cell, he wanted to keep studying, reading, and growing. And then he writes his own farewell, declaring his life is being poured out completely. He says, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Notice he doesn't say he won every single battle or that he was perfectly flawless. He says he chose faithfulness. He finished his race by pouring his life out completely for the message he believed in.
So here's the crucial takeaway. True faithfulness isn't measured by a cheering crowd or some massive worldly success. Paul ended his life in a cold cell, almost totally alone. But his final chapter was a complete triumph of endurance in the dark. It challenges how we view success and failure today, leaving us all to wonder, when you strip away the applause and the influence, what will your legacy of faithfulness look like?